Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'm here to introduce a pinch hitter in our North in the Civil War Symposium, New England Mass School Law Symposium held in October 2003. Our next speaker was supposed to be Harold Holzer, who at the time was the Director of Public Relations or Communications at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Harold and Frank frequently spoke together, and when Frank accepted our invitation, we also invited Harold. Harold accepted our invitation as well, and unfortunately came up sick the week of the symposium and wasn't back up to it, and felt like he was fairly contagious at the time, just didn't want to expose people to him or to whatever he might have had at the time. And so I had a hole in the schedule, and I knew what I wanted to cover. It was going to be the politics of command, because of course Harold was a Lincoln scholar as well, with many books on Lincoln. More perhaps than Frank has put out, but Harold wasn't there, and we had a need, and so I turned to Brooks, who had strong sense of the relationship between Lincoln and his generals and so forth, and so it seemed to me that this was something he could easily handle, being a professor of history at Arizona State and having written several books. So our speaker is Brooks Simpson, and he is going to speak on the politics of command in the North. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy Brooks Simpson's presentation.
Good afternoon. I trust I don't have to say anything else about last night. Although I had to get up at 3 a.m. to get Kareem Garcia and Jeff Nelson out of the detox tank and change Don Zimmer's Band-Aid. But those marks are small compared to the marks that some others are bearing this morning and this afternoon in their souls. So, anyway, having gotten those pleasantries out of the way, at least maybe the Patriots might win today, so, you have something. I'm giving a talk now entitled The Politics of Command, a title which, as Herman knows, is unabashedly stolen from a book about Confederate strategy, co-authored by Archer Jones and Tom Connolly. But when I'm talking about the politics of command, I'm talking about something different. I was brought to this in part by a new wave of books that have come out over the last 10 years or so, in which business leaders and folks who want to tell you how to succeed in business draw upon historical figures and use the maxims derived from their lives to tell you how to be much more successful at your Aflac business or whatever that you're going to do. And so we'll have books on, Winston Churchill on how to make a buck, which of course should be Winston Churchill on how to make a pound, but that's a different thing entirely. Leadership lessons from Abraham Lincoln. How to Succeed Without Really Trying by Robert E. Lee. And then a series of books that have come out on Ulysses S. Grant, including one titled rather colorfully Cigars, Whiskey, and Winning by a fellow named Al Catman. Now, I appreciate more than most the irony of using Ulysses S. Grant, whose career in business was, to say the least, less than stellar, as a role model for today's businessman. I thought those books would be on the remainder pile next to the new Japanese model of success books that came out in the late 70s and the 80s, how we should all be turning Japanese. Not quite. But those books are helpful in another way, and that is that they do suggest that there's more to generalship than simply battlefield performance, at least in the American context. And that the secret for success as an American military leader is not due solely to one's battlefield performance. That is a much different argument than the book that Herman and others were talking about yesterday, this new book that's come out about the war within the Union High Command, about a conflict between amateurs and professionals, political generals and the like. I'm not going to talk about political generals today. You've heard something of what I think about that argument last night. That basically, I think it's one thing to give a politician a commission. I think it's another thing to give him an independent command. That those political generals who were successful in the war, people like John Logan and Frank Blair, actually had to earn their stars, move up through the ranks, gain some experience, much like others. Whereas folks who were given high and independent commands at the beginning of the war, Nathaniel Banks, Benjamin Butler, for example, never learned any military skills and were albatrosses around the neck of the Union High Command. And that while these people may have been helpful in recruiting soldiers, and I think that in itself is a debatable proposition that's not in fact been demonstrated by any research, but even if we were to stipulate what needs to be proven in that regard, that still doesn't make the case for retention of these people in command during the latter years of the conflict. And I still believe the Lincoln administration would have been wiser to have shelved these people on the side than to keep them in positions of high responsibility. And one of the best ways to understand this again is that if you look at the commanders of the independent columns directed by Grant when he took over in 1864, a high proportion of them are these political generals. Okay, George Meade, for example, is still in charge of the Army of Potomac. People forget that Meade got that command and kept it for the remainder of the war. But that in the Shenandoah Valley, which was a key component of Grant's original plan, Franz Sigel was in command, much to Grant's disgust. Ben Butler was commander of the Army of the James, which was supposed to strike at Lee's rear and take Richmond and Petersburg and threaten the Confederates. Imagine how the Wilderness Campaign would have changed had the Army of the James been able to sever the rail connection between Richmond and Petersburg within the first 2 weeks of the campaign in May. Imagine what difficulties that would have presented for Robert E. Lee. Imagine how much different that slugfest in Virginia would have been if Lee had found his rear endangered. Both Sigel and Butler, as you know, failed in those missions. But everyone else, people tend to forget that the other part of Grant's plan was a two-pronged offensive into the Confederate heartland, with one prong being led by his reliable lieutenant, William T. Sherman, and the other prong to be led, unfortunately, by Nathaniel Banks, who was supposed to land at Mobile and then dive in the Confederate interior and force the Confederate Army in Georgia, the Army of Tennessee, to choose what to do. Well, remember, Banks at this time, at the beginning of 1864, is taking a nice vacation along the Red River in Louisiana, away from what's going on, in a clear case, by the way, of political meddling in military priorities. And thus, the Confederates could concentrate their force to oppose Sherman in the campaign that we now know as the Atlanta Campaign. That means out of 5 major drives, 3 were led by political generals, all of whom failed miserably in their assignment, and thus prolonged the conflict and added to the casualty toll, as well as endangering Lincoln's chance at re-election. I've not heard any positives presented to counter that dismal accounting. And so you've got to understand that, although I'm not talking about political generals, we could have a very interesting discussion about these folks, in which I think, again, the popular wisdom is open to a serious question. Nor am I going to draw hard and fast lines between amateurs and professionals. as some people might, because in fact, I think that's an artificial division, because in fact, some of the professional generals worked very hard at maintaining and enhancing their political connections. George McClellan, for example, was in constant correspondence with Democratic Party leaders and consulted with them after the release of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. Now, I want you to think about that. A general in the field. Let's think right now of a general in Iraq who would ask 4 or 5 Democratic advisors, let's say that war veteran Paul Begaglia, to come over to consult with them about the course of the war under President Bush. We would find that unusual, to say the least, somewhat upsetting, and certainly this is the stuff that could lead to the comeback of Rush Limbaugh. This is the kind of stuff that would really disturb folks. But McClellan had no problem. And McClellan, in fact, issued a proclamation to his soldiers, reminding them that the proper recourse was to be found at the polls. Well, this was good. George had clearly read the Constitution, understood how politics worked. I guess he felt he needed to remind his soldiers that a coup d'etat was out of the question at this point in time. Maybe later on, of course, the McClellan coup d'etat would still be fomenting somewhere in mid-Maryland at this time. Because, George, are you ready to move? Tomorrow. See, that's Margaret Mitchell stole that line. It's really George McClellan who would say, tomorrow is another day. It's not any Southern woman. Let's understand where this came from. But let's look at some of the guys who we've seen as successful or as non-political. William T. Sherman hated politicians except when he was related to them. His foster father was Thomas Ewing Sr., a wizened, gray-haired elder statesman. He had stepbrothers who were politically influential in Ohio, and his own brother, John Sherman, was a senator from Ohio during the war. And I think this is often overlooked, that Sherman had prominent people go to bat for him at certain critical times in his career who had influence with the Lincoln administration for political reasons. He had his political connections. When Sherman stepped down from command in 1861, there were rumors of his insanity. It was his political connections that saved him and helped restore him to command in 1862. His wife, his stepbrothers, his foster father, his brother went and saved Sherman's hide by pleading with Lincoln not to get rid of him altogether. Sherman had those connections, and he was not afraid to use them. And he was not afraid to give political advice, even as he said he hated politicians. And in one case, I think, as you look at Sherman's correspondence, there's certainly some interesting light to be shed on the myth that Sherman was always Grant's unwaveringly loyal lieutenant. And that is, if you want to find where Sherman's reservations about the Vicksburg campaign are best expressed, they are expressed in letters to his brother, the senator. A series of letters which made it very clear that while Sherman would support Grant's plan, he did so despite serious misgivings, and he did not think it would work. So if it didn't work, we would have wonderful CYA material for John Sherman to present. Well, see, my brother really didn't believe in this plan anyway. Now, if you read what's going on in Washington in the spring of 1863, as people are getting letters from various commanders, they share those letters with everybody else. There's lots of discussion going on. We know that, in fact, from letters to other folks. And so for General Sherman to tell his brother, Senator Sherman, that he had problems with the campaign was an act of loyalty to William T. Sherman, not an act of loyalty to his superior officer. Grant never knew about this, but once you uncover those records, you begin to ask anew certain questions about William T. Sherman's loyalty. On the other hand, you do recognize his ability to play the political game through familial connections. And even Ulysses S. Grant, after all, was well aware that he had a connection in Congress. Congressman Elihu B. Washburn from Grant's home in Galena had latched on to Grant early in the war as a trained military man at a time when there were very few to be had, and it had been Washburn who had been instrumental in forwarding Grant's career and at defending him at key critical points, sometimes perhaps being somewhat of an embarrassment to the general, but certainly it was a important political link where Grant could make sure that his views would be aired elsewhere, because if he needed to express what he thought, he could write Washburn, safe in the belief that Washburn would share those views and those letters with the President of the United States. So I think this idea that there are professionals who are above politics here and amateurs who are immersed in politics over here, that's a false dichotomy, and we might want to rethink how we approach a union generalship in a much more honest way in terms of the people we're talking about. Rather, I'd like to suggest today a couple of ideas of how to succeed as a general in the Union Army, as opposed to how to succeed in business, how to succeed as a general. And I'll set out here at the beginning that battlefield success by itself was not enough. We can just put that aside. Repeated battlefield failure is going to get you into trouble. We understand that. But simply to be an able general is not enough. And I'll come up with the best case example of that at the end of the talk. So I want to give you some ideas of how, if you were going to think about being a Union general, what you might want to consider doing. And they're very common sense at first, but then you realize as you look at the cases I'm going to put in front of you that not everyone exhibited common sense. And I'd say the overriding principle, one which a law school dean will readily understand, is keep the boss happy. Whatever you do, keep the boss happy. And how do you do that? Well, first of all, you understand your role. Why you're there, what you're supposed to do, what you're not supposed to do. You understand, and you had better understand, that you are to implement policy, not make it. Policy decisions are left to the politicians. Your job is to be the implementing tool of that policy. Even if you question that policy, make sure you do so in muted, reserved, and respectful tones. And make clear that your loyalty to your boss is always evident. Now, I say that even as I would want to point out here that military commanders inevitably made policy because they were put in positions where their decisions carried with them significant political implications. I think you will talk to a lot of professional soldiers who say they have nothing to do with politics, they have nothing to do with policy. Nothing could be further from the truth on multiple levels. First of all, the armed forces are among the most political organizations known to humankind. Anybody who makes their way all the way up has some skill in playing a bureaucratic political game. But let's look at a Civil War case here to talk about how generals make policy, whether they want to or not. I think the clearest example would be in the first couple of years of the war. Say you're a brigadier general in command of an outpost in western Kentucky or West Tennessee in 1862, and you look up and one of your sentries is bringing in an African-American refugee seeking protection from you. Now, this is early 1862. This is before there's an Emancipation Proclamation. This is while limited war is the goal of the conflict. What do you do? Here, all of a sudden, you're just, what's the administration's goal? Simply to reunite the country. What do you do with this fellow who's come to you? Well, if it's early 1862, there is one thing you might make reference to. You might find out whether the slave in question has been actively at work in Confederate fortifications. If he has, you can in fact capture him as contraband of war, and that's where the term would come from. Benjamin Butler, one of the few positive contributions he made to the Union war effort, basically took white Southerners at their word and said, these people are property, and you're using them to support your war effort, therefore, by the laws of war, I seize them as contraband of war. and they'll work for us and not for you. And that was certainly the spirit that was then embodied in the first Confiscation Act of August 1861. But let's say the slave in question has not been working in Confederate fortifications. Now what do you do? And what do you do when, as would often happen, within 5 to 10 minutes of the slave popping up, so would his master? Are you going to return the slave? Or are you going to keep the slave? Guess what? Whatever you do, it's a political decision now. You can't escape it. You might want to ask some questions. What if the master in question's a loyal master? Then do you want to go ahead and curry favor with loyal slaveholders by returning the slave? What if the master in question is a rabid secessionist? Are you going to return a slave to a rabid secessionist? But what about the complexion of the surrounding community? Do you want to encourage loyalty by wooing the disaffected? Or do you want to visit them with the hard hand of war, knowing full well that's going to complicate your life in terms of occupying those areas? What are you going to do? Whatever you do, it's a political decision. And for a while, in fact, the directives from Washington on what to do were few and far between. They start to evolve during 1862 as the war broadens and escalates. Congress on March 13th, 1862, for example, says that officers shouldn't return slaves, period, anymore. But that's not directed to a lot of personnel in the field who continue to ask these questions. Others are, in fact, instructed, return slaves to loyal masters. But you're going to make that initial political decision. You're down on the spot. You're going to have to deal with it. And how are you going to deal, by the way, with a population where you are the occupying force? A question that American military leaders are facing today. Are you going to woo people back? Or are you going to be harsh? Are you going to allow for the establishment of newspapers in the communities you now occupy? Are you going to allow for any kind of political dissent? Whatever you do as a military commander, you are making political decisions whether you want to or not. So you, in fact, have an inherent political role in what you do, especially during a civil war. That being said, you should understand your role, and you should not challenge administration policy in a loud or direct or public manner. Some generals did not follow this. To me, the most outstanding example of a general who failed to understand this was Don Carlos Buell. Now, General Buell, you remember, had a up and down military career in 1861 and 1862. He'd come at Shiloh on the second day and helped in the Union counterattack, coming at the evening the first day, and we all know the Buell and Grant partisans fight back and forth as to whether Buell saved Grant's cupcakes or if Grant had saved them on his own. Be this as it may, Buell then continued an up and down career and was relieved after the Confederate invasion of Kentucky was turned back in October 1862. And in fact, the only impact that Don Carlos Buell has had on central Kentucky since then is if you go to Perryville, there's a little diner where you can get Bragg and Buell burgers. Equally bad, both causing indigestion. The Bragg burger, I understand, is particularly disagreeable. And with the Buell burger, you're just not quite sure where to go next. But in 1864, when Grant took over as general-in-chief, he had this idea of inviting these fellows, these disaffected generals who had been on the shelf, including McClellan and Buell, back in the Army. And we do know there were negotiations carried on with third parties with McClellan. But there was a direct offer made to Don Carlos Buell for a corps command. And Buell turned it down, saying he no longer agreed with the aims for which the war was being waged. That a war against slavery was wrong. And therefore he would turn down a military command because he disagreed with the war aims of the administration. Military officers probably should accompany that with a letter of resignation, to be kind. Buell didn't. And for quite some time, Afterwards, Buell had to clear his name, or try to clear his name, from charges of disloyalty. But there was this letter, always there. I'm not going to fight for you because I don't agree while you're fighting. Probably not a good idea. A much more famous example, of course, is that of George McClellan. I think, by the way, old George has gotten a bit of the short end of the stick on this one. We do know that, for example, George McClellan consulted with Democratic politicians, including August Belmont, about various policy options. There's a rather lively correspondence going on between McClellan and New York's Democratic leaders. We even know that in 1863, after he was displaced as commander of the Army of the Potomac, McClellan actually supported the Democratic candidate for governor in Pennsylvania. And these are the levels of political activity that we find somewhat unsettling in military officers to this day. More than unsettling, in fact, of law. But the one thing for which McClellan is often chastised or ridiculed was his preparation of a document embodying his theory of war that he wrote in July 1862, known to history as the Harrison's Landing Letter. Now, to be sure, this letter was not composed at an ideal moment. It was prepared within a week of the end of the 7 Days campaign, in which McClellan had shown a great deal of dexterity in changing his base of operations, his line of supply, and then retreating across the Virginia countryside east of the Confederate capital at Richmond. But the fact is that McClellan had asked, and Lincoln had acceded to a request to lay the general's political views before the president. This was not unsolicited or unexpected advice. Lincoln had actually asked. And of course, McClellan did put out a case for limited war at this time. He was very worried about discussion about an Emancipation Act at this time being discussed by Congress, what becomes the Second Confiscation Act in July 1862. He was worried about how the war was evolving, and that he believed that a war that involved a war against slavery would complicate the process of reunion quite seriously and embitter Confederate resistance, and that a limited war was the way to go. And also, such a total war, a hard war, whatever you want to call it, would involve actions by the Lincoln administration that would compromise the very liberties that the Lincoln administration was supposed to be preserving. It's an interesting expression of policy. But that meant that once it was on a piece of paper, Lincoln knew that as he moved forward, McClellan was not going to be supportive of new administration initiatives. In contrast, Grant made sure to write letters to Elihu Washburn that said, whatever may be the policy of the administration, I will follow it. In other words, I'm your guy. I'll do what you tell me to do. I have opinions of my own, but they're immaterial. Now, he said that at a time when he wasn't quite sure about what the role of emancipation and slavery would be in the war in 1862. It's interesting that in 1863, for a guy who said, I have no opinions of my own, he then wrote Washburn again and said, oh, by the way, I think this idea of freeing the blacks and arming them is a great idea. And Lincoln, notice Lincoln didn't publicize the Harrison Landing letter, but Lincoln used Grant's letter endorsing the enlistment of African Americans publicly. My generals are on my side. They're my kind of people. Lincoln was quite happy to get that letter. So you kind of know what the boss wants to hear, and you go ahead and make sure that the boss hears it. An enthusiastic, cheerful acquiescence in administration policy. And in fact, in all of Grant's wartime correspondence, there is a single criticism of Lincoln that's made directly about Lincoln, and it's about, by the way, Lincoln's Reconstruction policy in Louisiana. He says it's premature and it shouldn't be run by military men. But in the end, he says, don't show this to anybody. It's, it's just my opinion, but I don't want to, make waves here. And of course, it's written in 1864 when Grant's got 3 stars and in a relatively secure position. Before that, whatever Grant thought about the administration, he kept it to himself. And you could argue that there were times when the administration tried Grant's patience, and that leads me to my second point: accept political interference and work around it. American generals sometimes talk about how they don't want politicians to interfere with what they're doing, that they're generals, let them do their own stuff. The politicians will merely muck things up. Well, I have news for any aspiring four-stars in the room. American politicians and civil leadership, it's one of their prerogatives that they get to stick their nose in the military business because that's how the civil power controls the military. That's the way it is. Yes, that does mean that a guy who managed to have the only PT boat sliced by a Japanese destroyer in 1942 or 1943, that's how he becomes commander-in-chief later on. The PT-109 is the only PT boat to suffer that fate. And it does mean that later on you have as commander-in-chief a guy whose great contribution to the South Pacific was playing poker, Richard Nixon, or Jimmy Carter. And I'm not even going to mention Len's favorite American president, William Jefferson Clinton, who of course is secretly Len's role model. But the fact is that these guys get to run things, or in Len's case, run away. Remember, Len, this is on tape. And that's how we run things here. Civil power controls the military power. When you are president, one of the jobs you get is that of commander-in-chief. And if that means that down the road you have a G.I. Joe action figure made after you, which, by the way, is coming out this fall, I'm not kidding you, the George W. Bush action figure, complete in flight gear, on sale at KB Toys for $39.99. I kid you not. It's an action figure. I'm just... there are so many places we can go with presidential action figures that I'm not going at this point. But, I mean, you're president. You get to run things. It's good to be president. Ask Martin Sheen. He wants to be president all the time on television. As a general, you have to accept political interference and you have to work around it. Now, sometimes that happens when you plan campaigns. For example, in 1863, after the surrender of Vicksburg, Grant wanted to mount an offensive into the interior of Mississippi and against Mobile, Alabama. He thought it was time to turn into the Confederate heartland immediately. And he was told that time, no, that's not a good idea because the president believes it's important to establish a military presence in the interior of Louisiana and looking towards Texas, which after all might be a target of interest for the French in Mexico. And so Grant pointed out that going to Texas was going way far away from any really interesting theater of operation, but he gave in. And in 1864, when he set out his plans again, said, I want to attack Mobile in the spring. It'd be very helpful to my military movements in the Confederate heartland if Confederate forces had to oppose not one but two invading armies. He was told again, well, you can do that, but only after Nathaniel Banks explores the beauties of the Red River in Louisiana. You can't do that, General Grant. The idea that Grant in 1864 had a free hand to conduct military operations as he wished, using the people he wanted to employ, is clearly contradicted by the historical record. Grant had to put up with as much political interference as did his predecessors, and to the extent that he got any elbow room, it's because he earned it by his performance, whereas some of his predecessors failed and thus sort of invited additional presidential interference. Another way in which civilian authorities overruled military authorities, and I know Herman's very familiar with this, is that Grant's initial campaign plan in 1864 was not a plunge into central Virginia. Rather, it was to take half of the Army of the Potomac, augment it with other troops, and strike at North Carolina. Penetrate in through North Carolina, cutting off Virginia from the rest of the Confederacy, sowing more disaffection among alienated North Carolinians, and there were plenty of alienated North Carolinians by 1864 as it was, and hopefully also pick up African Americans and mobilize them along the way. That's a war that uses mobility, the amphibious advantages that Union forces had. Grant believed it would force Lee either to come out of Virginia, his home field, or perhaps to attack Union armies, which he'd not, who would this time be on a defensive footing waiting for him, and play Fredericksburg in reverse if they could. But he was told, no, 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 you've got to go head-to-head with Lee, one-on-one. That's the way it's going to be. And so when Grant came east in 1864, the plan that he eventually adopts is sort of a miniature version of that plan. They strike up the James River against Richmond as the substitute for the North Carolina operation. But he was told, you can't do what you want to do. And not only that, but when you come east, you're going to stay here. We expect you, if you're not going to be at a desk in Washington, and Grant had no intention of staying at a desk in Washington, that was Halleck's job. Halleck was really good behind a desk. There is no picture of Henry Halleck or etching of Henry Halleck on a horse. I want you to think about that. Have you ever seen a picture of Halleck in the field? No. Good desk man, but not a good field commander. And Herman and I would disagree even on his abilities as a desk man. But in any case, fact is that Grant did not have freedom to plan his military operations. Now, Grant wasn't the first guy to have this problem. George McClellan had run into opposition from Lincoln in 1862 when he had offered his plans for attacking the Confederates in Virginia. And McClellan had actually prevailed to some degree, although in the end he felt he'd not been given the full support that he desired and deserved, in his mind at least. The difference was that Grant shut up. Whereas McClellan complained and complained and whined and complained and began to call the president the original guerrilla and all the rest of that. Not good, George. That tall original guerrilla guy, you know, it's like the 800-pound gorilla. Where does he want to sit? Wherever he wants to. Understand who runs what. What's interesting about Grant's plan is he was clearly dissatisfied, but he never left a trace of his dissatisfaction in his writings, to the point that you believe that the Lincoln-Grant team was seamless and flawless and always saw things alike, and they didn't. But that's because Grant understood that you bury your disappointments in those cases. So accept that politicians are going to interfere. Work around it. Accept that they have their priorities just as you do. And that when push comes to shove, they're the boss. Also accept that when it comes to appointments. Now here again, I think we've got an interesting comparison between Grant and McClellan. In 1862, the Army of the Potomac was only organized into divisions. And McClellan wanted to talk about organizing corps commanders, but he wanted to see who was qualified for corps command after seeing them in the field. Lincoln didn't like that, and he forced the appointment of 4 corps commanders. So McClellan couldn't even get the people he wanted as corps commanders. He finally got a 5th Corps commander, the 5th Corps under Fitz-John Porter. That was his corps commander. You notice how McClellan used the 5th Corps as sort of his imperial guard for the rest of his military operations. And the 5th Corps always got labeled, therefore, as the McClellan Corps, and got all kinds of trouble. If you read Joshua Chamberlain's narrative of the last weeks of the war, he's still upset that they're the McClellan Corps. And he feels the 5th Corps has always gotten the short end of the stick because of their association with Fitz-John Porter, and perhaps he has a point there. Certainly the fact that the guys in the 5th Corps felt that way is interesting. But the fact is the first 4 Corps commanders were presidential appointments made without consulting George McClellan. Now that's kind of tough when the boss says, yeah, the only military experience I have is running over fences in Illinois during the Black Hawk War, but I think I know who's a competent corps commander. You got to work with that. And if you don't, you get in trouble. Grant had a similar situation. The president took upon himself to appoint and to favor one of Grant's 1st Division and then corps commanders, John McClernand, Yeah, you see, when people talk about amateur generals and professional generals and political generals and West Pointers, McClernand's always one of these people they cite. It didn't matter that whether John McClernand was an amateur or professional. He was an idiot. There were professional generals who were idiots, and there's John McClernand. Now, John McClernand, in fact, if you talk to historians in the West, Terry Weichel, Ed Bars, and others, they'll actually point out that McClernand's corps often fought fairly well. His division fought well at Shiloh. His corps fought well during much of the Vicksburg campaign. It's interesting, though, when you press either Terry or Ed about, okay, what did McClernand do to achieve this? And they're a little quieter, and to ever make Ed Bars a little quieter is in itself somewhat of an achievement. They can't quite point out the same things about, but McClernand's men fought well, and he has to bear some credit for them fighting well. But the fact of the matter is that John McClernand was always writing letters to Abraham Lincoln, telling Lincoln how he could do things better. And Lincoln never told him to shut up. In fact, at one point, of course, McClernand came east, got a furlough, and then negotiated with Lincoln to raise his own army, so he claimed, although those regiments were actually being raised at that time, and to lead his own independent expedition against Vicksburg, so he could save the Union on his own. And Lincoln actually agreed to this plan and did not consult with other generals who had to try to figure out what was on the president's mind. For example, the final orders on the McClernand expedition are McClernand can use those troops that aren't needed by Grant. But that message takes a long time to get down to Grant, who has no idea what's going on for a while, and asks Henry Halleck what's going on, and Halleck's not too clear about what's going on. Well, this is a case of the boss meddling big time. And had it not been for McClernand's incompetence, and talk about taking your time to get to the battlefield, McClernand decided to get married during this time, and he had sort of a gigantic honeymoon of popping from recruiting camp to recruiting camp. I'm sure Mrs. McClernand thought this was just the way she wanted to spend her honeymoon. But that meant that in the end, he didn't get down there until the end of November. By that time, Grant had heard rumors and had already started expeditions, because he knew, if anything, that, you know, Mrs. McClernand might want General McClernand, but no one else did. So think of this, though. If you're in an organization and you've got a subordinate who is continually writing letters to your superior about what an idiot you are, how would you feel? And how would you feel knowing that the superior is not discouraging this circumvention of the chain of command? And I think this is, in fact, a key quality that Abraham Lincoln had that I think does not speak well of his abilities as Commander-in-Chief. He did allow these backdoor secondhand criticisms to reach him, and sometimes to unduly influence his opinion of what's going on. After all, who did Abraham Lincoln first discuss the Battle of Antietam with? Joe Hooker. He out there right off Boston Common. Joe Hooker, if you remember, was wounded early in the action on September 17th in the foot, as opposed to putting his foot in his mouth. And Hooker came back and told Lincoln, you know, if I'd been in command, we would have won easily. And that's the image that Lincoln took of McClellan's generalship at Antietam. Who's the first general with whom Lincoln talked about the Battle of Gettysburg? Dan Sickles, who managed to get himself wounded somewhat more seriously. And Sickles, of course, gave Lincoln a version of the Battle of Gettysburg that featured, guess who? Dan Sickles, who saved the Army of the Potomac by putting his own Third Corps in great peril, thus preventing a retreat. Now, if nothing else, Dan Sickles was the master of the political spin here, but the fact is that Lincoln, who we've always been told is so wise and wonderful and perceptive, bought this. And it forever influenced how he thought about George G. Meade. So how would you feel if you have people, and these are just two examples. Lincoln invited backdooring all the time. One of the classic examples, and one not highlighted because the general who was backdoored is not one of the favorites among American military historians, was Ambrose Burnside. After Fredericksburg, several generals, William B. Franklin, Baldy Smith, and others, and John Newton, make their way north to the capital and backdoor their commanding officer. So does Joe Hooker, who's become an expert at the backdoor by this time. And Lincoln listens to their complaints and their charges, to the point that Burnside himself came up and said, it's either me or them. I cannot tolerate these people in my command anymore. And he was basically telling Lincoln, you cannot tolerate this kind of behavior either. In this case, Lincoln dispersed them all and replaced them with Hooker, so Hooker's backdooring worked. So if you think of this in terms of a business organization, here's your boss, listen to people beneath you, and then sometimes those people get rewarded. Not a good way to work an organization, yet you got to accept those folks. Some generals had a problem accepting them. Grant accepted McClernand as a thorn in his side, worked to minimize his shortcomings, made sure to stay close to his core, and then when McClernand finally made a slip, canned him. McClernand was removed from command for the most trivial of military offenses, of failing offenses, failing to submit a general order to the commanding officer before it appeared in the newspapers. That's why he was dismissed. But when did Grant dismiss him? Once the siege of Vicksburg is well underway, once Grant's job is secure, then you can can McClernand. And Lincoln couldn't do anything about it. McClernand tried his best, by the way, went whining to Washington, complained here and there, and by that time it was too late. Lincoln realized that if he had to choose between Grant and McClernand after Vicksburg, that wasn't a very particularly hard choice to make. Although it is interesting to note that Lincoln restored McClernand to command of the 13th Corps early in 1864 under Banks, just before he put Grant in charge of all of the Union armies. And Grant was really ticked off that McClernand had been given a command. McClernand later resigns it in the middle of the year. You got to work with that political world, though. You can't refuse it. It's an inherent fact of life. Grant had to work with it in 1864 with Banks, Butler, and Sigel. These were not men of his choice. In fact, he had to work an awfully long time to get Banks removed. There's a rather active correspondence between Grant and Henry Halleck about the need to remove Nathaniel Banks. Halleck agrees with Grant that Banks is a waste of time, that he's an incompetent military leader. But he reminds Grant time again that the president prizes him, and it's not until Banks makes his incompetence manifest that Grant will have a case to remove him. And it's not, in fact, until Banks utterly fails during the Red River Campaign, or that Franz Sigel utterly fails in the Shenandoah Valley, that Grant can obtain the removal. So Grant has to put the political generals out there. They have to mess up, and only then can Grant make that case. In other words, you have to make the sacrifice of human life, and you have to make the sacrifice in terms of the failure of a campaign in order to make these people's failures so manifest that you can finally force the president's hand. That's an awkward way in which to operate an army, especially in a critical election year. And yet Grant had to work with that. You also have to understand the limits of the political world in which you operate as a military commander. For example, 1862 and 1864 were election years. And you have to understand what the political calendar is about in planning your military plans. You've got to achieve something before an election in order for the administration to reap maximum possible impact from it. And you certainly can't undertake a risky operation until after those election days because of the impact that military failure might have upon the administration's prospects. You've got, and we've talked about this yesterday, understand the impact of public opinion and perception on military operations, that unpopular American generals don't tend to last long. That generals who are seen as presiding over retreats and defeats or stalemates tend not to last long because the American public is impatient for action sooner rather than later. You've got to understand the interplay between military and political events, and this does bear very important part on the fate of Benjamin Butler, local favorite. In the summer of 1864. Grant tried to remove Ben Butler in July 1864. And the Lincoln administration dragged its heels, and in the end, Henry Halleck drafted a mangled order which proved incapable of implementation, and Butler kept his job for several more months. Why was Lincoln hesitant to move against Butler? Not simply because of any pretended political clout that Butler might have. And this is where I think military historians often wear blinders, because that same first week of July 1864 was the week in which Lincoln pocket vetoed the Wade-Davis bill. He'd already offended radical Republicans. He'd offended them as well by accepting the resignations a few days before that of Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase. Having already, in short, angered a certain portion of his party following his renomination in June by accepting Chase's resignation and by pocket vetoing the Wade-Davis bill, which brought a lot of radical Republicans out to criticize the president. Lincoln could not afford to do it again by removing Butler. And so they came up with a very convoluted plan whereby Butler would have stayed at Fort Monroe and West Pointers would have commanded the armies in the field. Butler made it very clear, if I'm here, I can command anywhere I want to, and I choose to command in the field. And the whole thing just unraveled. And it would not be until the beginning of 1865 that Grant could get rid of Ben Butler. And of course, when is that? After the election of 1864. At that time, Grant says, I've had it. And boy, Lincoln drafts that order very quickly at that point. There's no concern about political support there. There's no concern about what Butler might help him out there. No, it's done. He's gone. So much for loyalty there. But you've got to understand that as a commander, you have to work with the guy above you. You have to work with the guy in terms of what that fellow believes is a good general or a bad general. You have to understand his rationale for keeping these people in command, even if you disagree with it. You have to work within the limits in which you find yourself laboring. Finally, the other big piece of advice is don't threaten your boss. Not even threatening him with your bench coach as he toddles out of the dugout and heads towards the opposing team's star pitcher. And the fastest I've ever seen Don Zimmer move, and the fastest I've ever seen him go down. Don't threaten the boss. Now here, I think the examples are pretty easy to discern. George McClellan was always threatening the boss one way or another because his presidential ambitions were ill-concealed. His dealing with Democratic Party operatives and leaders, those dealings were well known. And so Lincoln knew that George McClellan was a possible opponent in waiting, and that McClellan's insufferable ego, if nothing else, made him an ideal Democratic presidential candidate in 1864. So Lincoln knew that. Lincoln knew there were other possible presidential candidates wearing shoulder straps. Joe Hooker, for example, thought he should bypass the political system altogether and establish a dictatorship. And Joe had just the right person to run that dictatorship. Just ask Joe who he might be. And remember, Lincoln finds out about this, some incautious conversation at a cocktail party, no doubt, and then tells Hooker, I've heard these stories, by the way. I'm going to give you command of the Army of the Potomac despite the fact that I've evidence that you're a backstabbing, double-dealing fellow who's ambitious for a dictatorship. I was rather tolerant of Lincoln. But I think Lincoln always kept a little eye on Joe Hooker afterwards, even as he kind of liked hearing some of the messages that Hooker gave him later on. He also was always aware that Hooker was a bit of a slippery character. Even William T. Sherman was known to threaten the boss in a different way, and that Sherman often expressed his disgust with the administration in the early years of the war, and including, by the way, a confrontation with Lincoln himself in 1861 when Lincoln was trying to give Sherman a job in the administration, and Sherman basically said, you people don't know what you're doing, leave me alone. Now, that's the usual Sherman tact. It's interesting to know, by the way, by 1864 and 65, Sherman had learned his lesson, and when he meets Lincoln again in March of 1865 aboard the River Queen, boy, is Sherman cooperative. And there's a famous painting at the cover, that's on the cover of this book that Herman and I were talking about, Conference aboard the River Queen, which hangs in the lighthouse. And what's most distinctive about this painting is that everyone's listening and Sherman's talking. And Sherman's talking with his finger gesticulating in there. He's moving around, and Lincoln's listening. Grant started off listening, crossing his fingers, don't say anything stupid, comp, as well as Admiral David Dixon Porter, who later described the meeting in his rather colorful memoirs. You shouldn't threaten the boss. Bad idea. And one of the people who showed how not to threaten the boss was Ulysses S. Grant. It's often forgotten that when Lincoln heard of the Battle of Chattanooga and the Union victory there in late November 1863, that didn't clinch Grant's case to become general-in-chief. There were no plans to establish a new general-in-chief. The Lincoln administration wasn't interested in this, and in fact, Lincoln told people it would be best to keep Grant in the West. He compared Grant's performance at Chattanooga with Meade's non-performance at Mine Run and said, I'm sure Grant could have done something, but it would not do to move Grant from the West. The idea of reviving the rank of lieutenant general came not from Abraham Lincoln, but from Congressman Elihu B. Washburn, who introduced such a bill in early December 1863. Members of Congress later amended the bill for a period of time to name Grant to that position because they were afraid that Lincoln would give Henry Halleck the third star. What's noteworthy about this is the Lincoln administration made no move whatsoever to push this legislation forward. And the reason is simple. Lincoln needed to find out more about Grant. Now, in 1863, he'd done an awful lot of work trying to find out about Grant's drinking. He also tried to find out about Grant's views on slavery and race and the enlistment of black soldiers. Been reassured on both of those points as much as one could expect, but he still didn't know whether Grant was interested in running for president. Because in late 1863, there were Grant for president booms that started, published in papers such as the New York Herald. Democratic politicians contacted Grant seeking to ascertain his interest in running for the White House in 1864 as a Democratic candidate. So the talk was in the air. Well, Lincoln's already been burned once on this issue with McClellan. He's not going to subject himself to the same difficulty. And so what he does is he sort of asks people, what's Grant about? What's he thinking about? And Grant begins to hear that the president's asking, what are you thinking about the presidency? And Grant makes sure, first of all, through a personal contact, one of Washburn's people, a guy named J. Russell Jones, he tells Jones, no, I'm not interested in becoming president. But then in a much more revealing letter, and here Grant knows how to manipulate that political network, in a letter to Frank Blair, one of his division commanders, who at this point is in Congress doing Lincoln's work and knocking apart Salmon Chase. Grant writes him a letter in which he makes it clear he does not want to run for president. And then he adds this P.S., do not show this letter to anyone unless it be the president himself. In other words, you idiot, you better show this letter to the president. Blair goes, Russell Jones goes, they visit the White House, they talk to Lincoln. After Lincoln has those conversations, the administration throws its weight behind the lieutenant general bill by making it clear that Lincoln will appoint Grant to the new command of general, the newly created rank of lieutenant general with command of the armies of the United States. Very smooth work by Grant. In 1864, Grant is also cooperative with the Lincoln administration when it comes to furloughing troops, for voting at home, and for setting up provisions for voting in the field. And he's fairly sure, of course, that most of those soldiers, as they eventually do, will vote for 4 more years for Honest Abe. Grant made clear in several letters his support for administration policies and for the re-election of the president. And in fact, when Lincoln apparently expressed some doubts in the middle of 1864 that Grant might be a supporter, Grant made sure once again to reassure through intermediaries the president of his support for the president's re-election. Don't threaten the boss. In fact, if you can be really good about it, invite the boss to the House. Now, we have pictures, of course, of Abraham Lincoln visiting George McClellan after the Battle of Antietam in 1862. We know that Lincoln visited McClellan several times, never had a really good time. And you could see these two guys, in fact, in the pictures in the post-Antietam meeting, they're looking at each other, and it's not a happy moment for either fellow. In fact, that's why there's one picture where McClellan makes sure he's surrounded by his entire staff, just in case he's going one-on-one with Lincoln, that there'll be other people there to break it up. But Lincoln had visited McClellan's command several times. He'd visited other Army commands. He'd spent some time, and these visits were often dreaded by the commanding generals, because one thing Lincoln would do was then consult with the corps commanders. He'd say, well, I know what you think. Now let me ask some other people what you think. And that was backdooring right in your face, as far as I'm concerned. After the 7-day battles, Lincoln consulted with each corps commanders about the situation there at Potomac, and McClellan knew about this, and you could not have been happy if you were George McClellan to see yourself being treated in such a way. But it was Grant who not only invited Lincoln to headquarters in 1865, the nice log cabins at City Point, but actually had Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, as a captain on Grant's staff. And you know the story of Robert Todd Lincoln. He'd gone to Exeter in 1860 and then gone to Harvard. And people complained during the war that Robert Todd Lincoln was off at college while other boys were being drafted and dying for the Union cause. And that Lincoln himself was afraid to commit Robert Todd Lincoln to the Union Army, not so much because of anything Lincoln was worried about, but because Mary Lincoln was very afraid of losing yet another son. She lost one son before they entered the White House. They had lost another son in the White House in 1862, Willie. And so Mary wanted nothing to do this, and so Lincoln finally writes a letter basically asking Grant, and he says, by the way, treat this as a letter not from the president, but as from a friend. Well, of course, the heading does say Executive Mansion, so it's kind of obvious where it's coming from. And he asked Grant to put him on his staff with a volunteer rank of captain, and Lincoln would pay for everything. Grant said, no, we'll put him on the staff, regular commission, and Army will pay for him, and he'll be a really good messenger boy. And they take care of Robert Todd Lincoln all over the place, and the Lincolns come down in March, and they have a great time. Lincoln feels relaxed. It's from that headquarters that Lincoln goes to Richmond at the beginning of April 1865 after the fall of the Confederate capital. Not only does Grant put up with the president and make him feel at home, but the Grants put up with Mrs. Lincoln, who had several outbursts during this visit, embarrassing outbursts with serious consequences later on, because it's because of these outbursts that the Grants do not accompany the Lincolns to Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865. So anybody who welcomed Lincoln and put up with Mary knows what to do. This is how you treat the boss, and this is how you succeed. So there's more than simply the dimensions of battlefield performance, and I want to conclude by pointing out where battlefield performance by itself is not enough. The classic case is that of George Henry Thomas, one of the most competent Union field commanders produced by the war, and yet somebody who never quite rose to the position that you might think he would have attained given his achievements. Now, some people say, well, that's because he was of Virginia birth and there was some suspicion about that. Not after 1861. I mean, Thomas, by early 1862, wins a small but highly heralded victory at a place called Mill Springs in Kentucky. No one ever mentions again Thomas is a Virginian. It's rather because Thomas can't get along with the boss. In the middle of 1862, at the beginning of the Kentucky campaign, Thomas was invited to take over command of the Army of the Ohio, as it was called at the time, later the Army of the Cumberland, and replaced Don Carlos Buell. Thomas turned down the command, saying that Buell was in the middle of a military campaign and he should be allowed to have that campaign unfold. That's interesting, by the way. People say what an honorable man Thomas was, but in fact, Thomas had grave reservations about how Buell was conducting the campaign, and it was also as much, I don't want to take over this mess at this point. After the Perryville campaign concludes, Buell, of course, is relieved right after the October elections days in 1862. Lincoln waited until right after the October elections to relieve Buell, and right after the November elections, he relieved McClellan, the day after. And so here's then who's Buell's replacement? Not Thomas, but William S. Rosecrans. Thomas was furious and made clear his hurt pride, claiming that he outranked Rosecrans, that he'd been offered the job before, and by all means it should have been his job now. That was somewhat unseemly of Thomas to whine like that. He had a shot, he turned it down. Rosecrans had in the meantime proven himself as a fairly interesting commander in the Corinth campaign, and he seemed to be a star on the rise. But Thomas never quite got over that slight. Now, of course, in 1863, when Rosecrans is displaced, the displacement took place in a very interesting way. Grant was given two sets of orders that named him to what were called the Military Command of the Missouri. One of those orders allowed him to keep Rosecrans. Grant and Rosecrans didn't like each other. There had been some personal animosity that reached pretty intense levels. The other order was Grant would come in and Thomas would take over. Grant was not given his own choice as the commander of the Army of the Cumberland. It was either going to be Rosecrans or Thomas. Grant chose the order with Thomas because whatever he thought of Thomas, he thought much less of Rosecrans. But when Grant came down to Chattanooga, Thomas didn't work well with the boss either. In this case, his military boss. There was a coldness that developed between Grant and Thomas, which worked against the sort of chemistry that superior and subordinate have to have. And that was made manifest during the attack upon Missionary Ridge, during other planning during the operations around Chattanooga, during some operations in the winter of 1864, and of course they exploded all over the place during the Nashville campaign, where Thomas wouldn't communicate with Grant and Grant grew impatient with Thomas. Now, if you look at that correspondence and just sort of take yourself away, because there are people who are Grant partisans and there are people who are Thomas partisans. If you just read the correspondence, you get people who are just not willing to work with each other. It's a case where both fellows bear a great deal of responsibility. But Thomas had an attitude problem. And he couldn't cooperate in trying to work with Grant and saying, look, this is what's going on. Grant had to keep on saying, why aren't you attacking? Why aren't you attacking? Thomas would wait a couple of days. Oh, by the way, this is why I'm not attacking. I told you I was going to attack this day, but I didn't, and this is why. Well, if you are a manager and you have a subordinate, you're trying to get that subordinate to do things, and things don't happen, after a while you ask the subordinate, why isn't something happening? And then they tell you, oh, I should have told you 2 days ago. You get a little irritated after a while. So, though Thomas had great military talent, he wasn't able to work within the organizational structure and please his boss. He wasn't able to do the other things that a military commander had to do to succeed, either with his civil superiors, as in 1862, or his military superiors, as in 1864. There's very little support for Thomas by 1864. He also had no spokesperson in Congress, no political connections to work whatsoever. He was isolated. And so even after Nashville, and see, I would argue that that defenders of George Thomas's reputation shouldn't point to Nashville, because the person most responsible for the Battle of Nashville is John Bell Hood, who had a ragtag group up there by that time, and I believe that any competent Union general would have won the Battle of Nashville, given the condition of the Confederate forces. But afterwards, Grant stripped Thomas of his command. No, he didn't remove them. He just detached people, right, left, center. You notice that after Nashville, Thomas, this great victory, Thomas fades away altogether. Because that's when Grant could take his ultimate revenge. You don't work with me, that's fine. I'm not going to work with you anymore. And so Thomas becomes somebody who to this day, has been overlooked and ignored, and when he's defended with almost a mindless passion by people who are so upset that he's been overlooked. And that's in part because Thomas didn't understand all the dimensions of the politics of command. Thank you. Questions?
What's your assessment of Meade's behavior and how he related to Grant when Grant was just run up?
Well, Meade's behavior during the 1864 campaign, I think what we can understand after a while is George Meade was not going to lose the war, but he wasn't going to win it. That George Meade was not good at coordinating offensive operations. He was not good at getting his corps commanders to do things. And the corps commanders in the Army of the Potomac, even Winfield Scott Hancock, did not perform very well in the campaigns of 1864. And I think Grant felt impatient after a while at the inflexibility and the slowness that he encountered with those folks, and began to push and innovate and improvise, sometimes asking far too much too quickly of a command system that wasn't able and unused to reacting so quickly. But in Meade's defense, though, Grant did understand that he was an essential link in the communication chain, and for Grant to have taken over direct command of the Army of the Potomac, in addition to everything else he had to do, would have been too much. So it's a flawed command system, but it's not clear that the alternative would have been a significant improvement. Yeah.
Brooks, if I could play the devil's advocate here.
I've heard that phrase, yes.
Yes, I'm wondering, did Lincoln, I never got the impression that Lincoln encouraged the backdoor diplomacy, but he more or less didn't discourage it. But if I was in Lincoln's place and Halleck was the front door, I certainly would allow, backdoor diplomacy. I knew that when Sickles came to the White House, Lincoln knew clearly that the guy was a nincompoop from years before in New York politics. And eventually he threw Sickles out over the family affair with Mary's half-sister. And Lincoln understood that Booker was a braggart, had a drinking problem, was an egomaniac. So it seems to me, and you mentioned the Wade Davis bill, in retrospect, I was glad that Lincoln vetoed that. And I was glad that he got rid of Chase when he got rid of that.
Well, yeah, but the point is that having done those two things to then hit another radical Republican at that critical moment.
I agree with you on that also. But all I'm saying is I think that Lincoln made decisions on information that he had at the time. And a lot of that information comes from old brains himself, a first-rate, second-rate clerk. So it seems like the more information that Lincoln had, maybe his decisions.
I think Lincoln reacted a lot of times based on what he heard first, and sometimes he reacted in intemperate ways. And that doesn't make Lincoln a horrible president, but it makes him a human one. I mean, for example, there's that, historians now quote that letter that he writes to McClellan during the Antietam campaign, the aftermath of the battle, about what, pray tell, have your horses been doing that they are so tired? And McClellan had to patiently explain to him, well, actually, in this case, Mr. President, you really don't know what you're talking about. My army's bushed, and we know from reading letters from the Army of the Potomac that it was undersupplied after Antietam. They were in bad shape. Lincoln liked to make caustic remarks. He shared them with others. I mean, I think that the McClellan people have a point, even though their own man shot his mouth off. When Lincoln's out there and says, what do you think this is? And someone replies, it's the Army of the Potomac, and he says, no, it's McClellan's bodyguard. This is not a good way for a boss to behave, to make sharp comments, or to make kidding comments, even the witty comments, like the alleged comment, please tell me what bottle or what brand of whiskey Grant drinks so I can send a barrel to all my people. The president should have shut his mouth. And that's the kind of thing that foments a lot of disharmony. And as far as the back door, no, these people came to Washington. You can say, I'm not in. You could say, thank you for your opinion. I'd like to hear some others. This is who gets there first gets the story. I mean, Sickles really shaped how Lincoln felt about Meade. And the fact is, if Lincoln knew so much about Sickles, then why did he even trust? Why did he trust what Sickles told him? If he knew Hooker was a braggart, why did he accept Hooker's version of the Battle of Antietam? When he visits the Antietam battlefield, everyone later on complains all he wanted to see was where Hooker's people fought. So, Lincoln's human, and that's a good thing to realize. But part of that humanity means that he often made mistakes that are not the ideal way a president ought to behave.
But I'm trying to think about how McClellan's political actions, what the extending effect they were, in the life and times of the politics of the day. I sometimes think about MacArthur at the 38th parallel. Is
Mhm.
some sort of an analogy for that?
Well, certainly Harry Truman liked to make that analogy later on. Because he liked to portray himself as Lincoln, too, which was interesting given the Truman family had been Confederate. And actually, it's very interesting to watch how presidents understand their predecessors or misunderstand their predecessors and trying to stand up in the shadow of their predecessors. The fact of the matter is, though, at the beginning when McClellan was appointed, Lincoln thought he was wonderful. And at the beginning when McClellan was appointed, the two men saw eye to eye on political issues. If McClellan had certain personality problems, so did Lincoln. I think when a military commander says, I should have the right to appoint my immediate subordinates after seeing how they perform in the field, and the president's response is, I'm going to appoint 4 people with whom you don't get along, and those are your immediate subordinates. There's a reason for a complaint there. And I really think that you can be critical of Lincoln's handling of his relationship with McClellan without in any way becoming a McClellan apologist or defender. That this was a dysfunctional relationship between two men, just as the Grant-Thomas relationship was dysfunctional. I mean, I've always been astonished, not at all admirers of George Thomas, but a certain cadre of them who believe that there's a conspiracy of historians who actively work to disparage George Thomas.
I've heard that.
And I can't understand these people. I mean, I know that when I was writing and say, oh, now we're going to get Thomas. Oh, this is great. I mean, that's not how this works. But certainly, if you look at those two guys, they had no chemistry, no mutual trust. Thomas did not respect Grant at all. And you can understand why they had a flawed working relationship in a way that, let's say, Grant and Sherman got away with murder sometimes under Grant, as did Sheridan. But because of the working relationship, Grant could go ahead and cut them some slack. He wouldn't cut slack with Thomas because they didn't have that kind of relationship. You got to get along with the boss. If you don't get along with the boss, it's going to be tough on you.
Last question.
Yeah.
Was there any politics behind the Sheridan relief of Warren at the Battle of Five Forks?
No, pure personal vengeance. That Governor K. Warren paid on April Fool's Day, 1865, the debt that he had incurred during the preceding 11 months. That what happened at Five Forks was not, in my mind, sufficient grounds on which to relieve Warren. Having put up with Warren for 11 months, that was it. I mean, look, Gouverneur Warren used to be the direct commander of my ancestor, the New York Zouave Brigade. And he's got the prettiest monument at Gettysburg. But he just didn't work well with people as a corps commander. And he'd done enough things wrong that people were impatient and they reacted thinking of what might happen next. So it wasn't political, it wasn't a revenge for Warren's conservative political opinions, although he had them. It was rather an impatience with, we really have the Confederates on the run this time and you're not going to screw up. And if you look like you're going to screw, by God, we're going to relieve you. Get out of our way. And that's what happens during the Appomattox campaign, is basically the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James are regrouped into two Army combat groups, one led by Grant and one led by Sheridan. The man who fades out of the picture is Meade. None of the original commanders of the Army of Potomac play key roles in that pursuit. It's newly appointed guys like Humphreys and Griffith and John Park. Those are the guys. Those are Grant's guys, so to speak, even if they're not always happy with Grant personally. So that's a much different cadre. There's no corps commander except for Sheridan, who's really now in a combat group commander, who's in place by the middle of that campaign. You know, Meade is so out of the way that he's not even at Appomattox. He's sick, he's left behind, and they don't even wait for him to show up. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much.